Rory, thank you very much for joining me.
Of course.
I'm committing the ultimate sin, I think, as a video guy, because I know Rory as he was one of my clients' guests on the podcast, and I've snatched him away to have him on my own. It's almost like I've got a small guilt trip about it.
It was last year. It's ages ago.
Yeah, exactly. 2023. Time's moved on. So, Rory, I obviously know a bit about you. For anyone listening or watching, could you please give a brief introduction of yourself?
So I run a business called Trust Keith. We help companies become and stay compliant with data regulation. We're essentially a sort of privacy management solution for startup and scale up businesses. We're bootstrapped. That means we haven't raised any outside money. We're a team of sort of 11, 12. We've been going for about 4.5 years now. Prior to that, I built another startup which didn't quite work out, but that was sort of like a 4-year experience, having dropped out of uni to do, which was venture backed. It was angel funded. So it's kind of two different ways of doing it.
So did you always know you wanted to be an entrepreneur? Did you just like the idea of freedom or 24/7 stress? What was it that led you down the path, you think?
It's easy to connect the dots looking backwards, but it was definitely a bit of a flare when I was at prep school. So when I was sort of 8 or 9, I used to go and there was the craze with top trumps. So I'd go and handmade my own with cardboard printer, go and laminate it. It probably cost a ton. But obviously my parents would buy me the laminate and the card.
Nice.
And I'd go and flog them for £1 a pack, which terrible unit economics. Well, I did that, and then I guess along the way, so I've got older siblings. Whenever they had friends over, I'd cook their friends breakfast and put out a tip jar, or just sort of, there was always little things like that along the way that I look back and I'm like, oh, well, that was something, but it didn't really get reignited until my first business when I was at uni.
So your first business, can you tell us what that was?
So it was a skiing sports meetup app, and we kind of positioned it as Tinder for action sports. And it was primarily scratching a bit of a personal itch around being in a new place and wanting to meet other people to go ride with. And we raised a bit of angel funding, went out to the US during the winter season. We were in Denver, or in Boulder, which is just outside Denver in Colorado, so right in the bang in the middle, where you've got Breckenridge, Vail, Aspen, Keystone, and a ton of other sort of smaller resorts, literally all within sort of 2-3 hour drive. And there's a really big, active college ski organization there that we partnered with. And that's kind of the beginning of it. We executed pretty poorly. We ran out of winter season to kind of really validate anything. But that was the beginning of it. And ultimately, over the following kind of 3.5 years, it sort of pivoted pretty substantially into some very different places.
With that first business, what went wrong? What went right? What were the learnings?
I think even the beginning one was just sort of problem validation. I think you see this a lot with, I think particularly sort of first-time entrepreneurs, but young ones who they've got an itch and it's like, oh, I'm passionate about skiing. Let's go and build a business in skiing. And it's like, consumer, marketplace? Like, when are you going to monetize? Like, all these different things just didn't even cross my mind. And this was back in 2014. So obviously you had Facebook in the background, but there was a lot of other social apps then, Sport Lobster and a couple others that were kind of seemingly doing really, really well. And it was like the whole mindset of like, no, we're just going to get loads of users. That'll be enough. It's a future problem to worry about monetization. But I think primarily is we didn't really get to grips with what problem we were solving. Like, it was clearly not a big enough problem for enough people, and or we did not articulate or solve for that adequately. And I think it's that problem solving mentality that I think we were just way too light on, which is something that I'm really, really mindful now of. Like, what's the job to be done we're actually solving? How big a pain for it? Is that justify X amount of money that we want to price for it, and kind of working backwards, as it were.
To be fair, though, it's almost a lesson you had to learn to get you to where you are now.
Yeah, things like, and these are obviously very, very biased, but don't go B2C, go B2B. Don't do rolling contracts, do minimum 12-month commitments. Don't do anything less than, obviously with scale, you can charge whatever you want, but you should be charging like minimum sort of 10 grand a year for these kind of things. It's like things like that you start learning of, like, well, what mode of business do you want to play? Do you want to play uber hard? Great, go and build like an Instagram equivalent, and maybe you too will be bought by Facebook. Or go and build B2B where you get 10 customers or you get 50 customers and you've got a really viable, decent business. That's achievable. You can find 50 customers.
Yeah.
Like,
How would you go about finding 50 customers
today?
Depends
what it is and how much it is. I think initially there's your own network. And there's obviously that inner circle of people you already know. There's probably like 20 or 30 people. And then that next ring is almost just trawling through your LinkedIn and being like, who is relevant here? Who do I have a reasonable excuse, or like it's kind of viable if I just took a shot? I can email them, they kind of know me, I get a response. So it's things like that.
With that, okay, so you're now at this point where you know that you enjoy building businesses. You've managed to find yourself in privacy and compliance. So you're at 4.5 years?
Yeah.
How's it going?
Depends how you look at it. I think if you look at sort of day one expectations, or just sort of where I've come from, where we've come from as a business, I think we've made huge strides. And we started off, again, bootstrap mentality. We started from nothing. Like I put in £1,500 for the legal fees, and the rest has all been customer revenue. And it's sort of, there's things we're doing now that felt a million miles away on day one. Things like the fact that we now have a software application that our customers utilize. And like, that's got like a lot of things, it's got a long way to go, but we're now solving and we're doing that. And there's a lot of things like that I reflected on and be like, wow, we're doing some really cool stuff. So kind of to that question, it kind of depends where you zoom in. Like there's obviously inherent challenges, I think, with any business that one works through, pain points, setbacks, things like that. And I think, there's definitely been some challenging periods in the last year or so. But if you zoom out or you pick up on certain things, like the overriding theme to me is it's working. It's now persisting and continuing to make the right decisions and ensuring that we position to genuinely take advantage of the opportunity at hand. And I think the opportunity and the potential that we have is huge. And that's what, I guess, even in the low moments, it's that sort of shimmering horizon that sort of still feels really clear to me. And I think we've got a lot clearer over the last 4.5 years about what that horizon could be. Like, what is the potential here? Like, what does that mean from a product positioning and like where we sit in the market in the long term? And all those sort of answers were a lot clearer on that. So I think maybe just summarize a little bit, it's sort of, there's been some pretty painful periods along the journey, but that future is looking brighter and brighter, and, we'll ride out the storms and we'll get there.
Can you talk about what those painful periods have been?
I think there's a couple of different periods. I think more generally, things like when you're trying to solve for what you do and how you do it. Maybe you've sold a story to a customer, what's clicking on the sort of the front end side of things of like, cool, we've unlocked that contract, great, now it's over to delivery. And then being able to translate what we're promising into a really neat and aligned experience has had some challenges along the way, because we're constantly iterating it to get better. It means we're always managing quite a lot of legacy change in terms of, well, that's how we used to do it, but now it's how we're now doing it. And it's just that innovation cycle that I think has been quite painful to then manage that across the business, both from internal of like, hey, this is the soundbite of what we do, or like this particular bit, how we do it, and being consistent with that across our customer base. There's things like that have been a bit challenging, and we're getting better. And as we mature, the change management of that is naturally going to become a lot neater. And then other pains would be, I think, probably more just the emotional roller coaster of you winning a couple of deals, everything's great, then things out of your control hit you in the face, whether that's certain macro events. And in our case, a lot of our customers are venture funded, so they're a lot more at the mercy of the funding market. So if funding really dries up and they're having to turn 1-year budgets into 2-year budgets, things get scrutinized. And then it's all hands on deck to save what you can with that customer. And in a lot of cases, we've revised the scope and we continue to work with them. But in some other cases, they've gone out of business. And it's like there's only so much control we have over that. And I think, that last year, the back end of last year, there's an element of that kind of painful market conditions. But then rewind a year or so before that, and the equivalent was playing out with COVID, or, when Ukraine kicked off, there's probably a 3-4 month period where no one was making any decisions. So deals just kind of slowed up a little bit. Yeah, there's been plenty of painful periods, but I think it also is how you set your expectations. Like, it's only painful if I tell myself it should be easy. But if I tell myself, no, the building business is hard, it's hard because not many people can do it or will do it, it's meant to be hard. And then you turn around and you're like, well, good.
What do you tell yourself, or do those moments flip-flop between this is hard or it should be hard?
I think you got to reflect on that kind of stoic mentality of it's meant to be hard, and like lean into that. And I think it's only upsetting when you feel like any setback or any pain is preventing you from achieving your ultimate outcome. And if you told yourself about some like end of the rainbow or some kind of glittery, like, oh, that's the finish line mentality, then loads of things are going to feel like, oh, it's now at risk, now it's at risk, like we're never going to get there. But if you just reset your expectations that that finish line is a mirage, it's never going to properly arrive, it's always going to be quite painful. And actually like leaning into that is a bit more, you give yourself a bit more agency when you believe that like, no, it's going to be painful, I can manage this, I'm going to grow as a person. And realizing that there's more to the business than just purely a, you know, what is it, crudely, is it just about enterprise value, or is it more about your growth and development personally, the growth and development of building and developing a team? Like, there's so many other things that you can grow from. And if you lean into the things that you can control, which is like developing a team, launching new products, all these things like that, typically the rest tends to work itself out. And I think I've definitely been reminding myself more recently of, cool, there's a lot of stuff here I can't control. Regardless of what happens, what do I want to come out the back end with? And there's certain like skills or getting better at certain types of conversations or decision making and things like that, that, you know, can be a bit painful, but it's still, you know, cool. Well, I'm going to get better.
Well, it sounds like there's having to be like a real evolution of you, not just as a leader, but as an individual. You're playing both sides of that, the personal Rory and the professional Rory, because you've got to adapt to what's going on in the business, but also with your own headspace and mindset.
Yeah.
And are you feeling that? Are you feeling, it's like you said, you lean into it. You lean into that pain and the growth comes. Like, are you aware of the growth you've made in the last 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? Like, what were you like 3-4 years ago?
It's tricky because it's not, I guess there's occasional moments that are reflective of like, oh, I managed that slightly differently, or like, oh, I'm not panicking. Or there's things like that that if you really stop, it's like, oh yeah, okay, I've come a long way out of that. And I think one thing would be just managing my energy or my like emotions. Like I'm a lot more between a sort of 4 and a 6 out of 10 on, okay, we've had a big win and we've taken a loss on something. Like, am I going to get really upset about it, or am I going to get really high about it? Probably a little bit, but then I bring myself back to the middle and be like, well, let's see how it goes.
With that mindset piece, with the constant growth, I mean, we know what the entrepreneurial world is like in London. It's very competitive. There's like always big stories. There's always a slight comparison thing going on. How are you feeling in the market 4.5 years in? And hopefully you're going to go easy on yourself as well, because 2020 to 2022, and arguably even up to now, semi write-off.
It's always quite healthy to have a bit of a tension for wanting more or having that comparison mentality, because if you don't, you're going to be quite happy standing still. I think it's quite natural. I think it's more just being mindful of that tension, because it's obviously on the far extreme of it's never enough, it's more, you're never going to be happy or content, as it were. And I think, you know, knowing that, but then also looking where we're at now, and it's like, well, I mean, who are we comparing ourselves to? There's definitely like much larger players or adjacent industry brands that I think we can do that. So obviously I'm feeling frustrated and sort of like impatient for like, why the hell are we not there yet? Like, we're going to get that. We need to make this decision faster. We need to do this. We need to do that. So there's plenty of things where I think we're not there. The job's not done yet. We've got a ton of work to do and we're miles away, but it's not done yet. And I think that mentality of course we want more. And we aspire to achieve a lot, both personally, but definitely as like a management and as like a business team, for sure. Like we're ambitious and we've got a long way to go. So I think it's just that mentality of like, we're not, you know, give ourselves too many pats on the back. It's like, yeah, we've got here, great, but we've got a long way to go. Like, job's not done.
So you mentioned personally, what are you working on to manage all these kind of responsibilities and this very unique level of introspection and self-awareness?
I do a lot of coaching. So there's a business coach I've been working with really since just before I started. So he's always been a good sounding board, and always have good conversations with him because he's quite holistic. You could deem him a life coach, but he's very helpful in, I guess, bringing me back to what was my outcome on day one, staying true to myself of like, what does success actually look like, so you don't get carried away with the momentum, as it were, and whatever things iterate as led by comparison or whatever. And then there's some advisors and another coach I work with as well, and I think with some of them there's definitely like themes that I pick up with myself of like, why am I avoiding that, or how can I run that better, whether it's a decision making process or managing certain types of conversations, or spending time to just look a little bit further ahead. There's things like that that I know I've got a lot to overcome and get better at, and those types of advice sessions and stuff like coaching sessions are really, really helpful, because it's just a great place to get feedback, but also to have slightly more unique conversations that I can't have with the team.
What tactics have they given you that you found really effective?
So there's one line recently around like a mentality thing that I'm not there yet, but I aspire to be like, that's the mindset I really want. And that would be, I don't care what happens, but I have a preference. And if you can genuinely embody the fact like, I don't really care what happens with the business, I've got a preference, then that's such a safer and more sort of healthy mind space to be in. But I'm not there yet. I really care what happens. But until I can get to that mindset, which is the case, I think, for a lot of things in life, of any other goals or things one's working on. But I think that's really hit me quite hard whenever I heard it a couple months ago. That's just sort of like, what does that look like? How do I get to that space as like a home?
I have to ask, is it quite tiring working on the mindset and working on the business and tying everything together?
I think all of it's just personal development. It's just feedback, and you go again, get more feedback, go again. So to me, it's all holistic, and I think, and it's tricky, but I know a lot of founders who are like this, where work is obviously it's all consuming, but it's almost like there's no. It's just life, and it's like it's not this compartment of like I'm working or I'm not working. It's just sort of all of this for me, whether it's personal development around mindset management or whatever, and then solving business problems. Like they all merge into one, because a lot of them transcend anything I'm working on right now, because they're life skills or they're things that are going to serve me later, that they're all just slowly compounding.
One of the conversations one of these coaches has with you is, what does success look like? Have you got an answer to that yet? Have you got an idea of what you think that could be?
I feel clear about what success looks like in the long term for myself. And then for the business, it's really just fulfilling our potential. And it's like we getting onto a trajectory where we can viably and realistically get to, you look around, but there's like revenue milestones around sort of 10 million of annual recurring revenue. There's things like that. It's like, yeah, that's what success looks like. But if we've built a really scalable, efficient business with a team of highly motivated, ambitious, and sort of growth-minded people, and we're not there yet, but we're on our way, that's still massively successful in my mind.
It is one of those big questions, right? It's like, what does success look like personally and professionally? If I was sitting opposite somebody and they were to ask me that, I probably wouldn't have an answer. I've not thought about it. And I'd say the majority of the people are probably the same, because I wonder, maybe I was projecting a little when I was like, oh, you're working on this stuff in yourself and the business. Like, is it tiring? Because it is a very deep, intense journey. And how many people aren't doing it, especially in the startup world? People are doing, on to the next thing. What's the next? It's not even if they set themselves objectives or goals. It's, okay, they've achieved something. They feel they're making the right positive steps in the right direction. So then something works. Oh, that's right. And that's right. And that's right. And it's just a constant kind of stream of doing. So I don't know if in your circle of founders or friends, do you find the conversation is quite, do these conversations happen where people are like, what's your goals? Where you set this? How are you doing? How's the headspace? Outside of work, rather than how's the business, is how are you doing with it all?
Yeah, 100%. And there's a friend of mine who we catch up with monthly, and there's kind of like a different like scorecard for different kind of things, like different kind of boxes in life, whether that's sort of diet, exercise. It's like kind of like 12 different criteria that we kind of rank our own lives on, and then which you do on like a monthly basis, and you kind of compare notes of like, I'm not there yet. Any tips on how I can? Okay, maybe I'm going to try that next time. Or right, this is a recurring theme. What do I need? Like, am I okay with that being like that? And maybe that has to suffer right now, but being more mindful around like what is happiness, what is like fulfillment and things like that look like. I find that's quite helpful. And there's something where like there's that particular friend I catch up with monthly, but I find off the back of that and driven a lot by that, I now bring that type of conversation a lot more up.
Nice. Almost like an accountability partner.
There's a sense of accountability with, have you updated your scorecard? But then there's that separate piece of, you create that trusted environment to then talk openly about where you're winning, where you're losing. Like, do you feel like you're spending enough time with your friends? Are you being intentional enough? Do you feel guilty about it? There's things like that you can then talk about. And, speaking with someone who's in that same headspace of trying to run a business, trying to do all these things, you've kind of got a similar, I guess, mentality of like, okay, how can we both get better at this? What can we learn from each other?
What do you feel that's really improved from where your first scorecard and you were like, maybe I'm not spending enough time with friends, or I'm not doing this? Where do you see like the drastic improvement in that? And do you feel it's made a difference to your quality of life in some areas?
I think it's about being intentional, and by what you measure improves, and it's served a really good forcing function to, I guess, address what does good look like right now, and am I meeting that requirement? Am I pushing forward on some of these things? Are things improving? Am I progressing? And they often say that happiness is just that sense of progress. Are you making progress towards this goal or this outcome that you have? And things like this, I personally find really useful because a lot of them are things I have control over. And that one of the challenges of building a business or anything like that is there's only so many things I have control over. If we don't hit a revenue number, it kind of is what it is on certain occasions. Obviously, there's things you can do, but broad, it's a little bit more out of my control. And if I am I going to define my sense of fulfillment, my happiness, sort of by that thing that I don't really control, then I'm setting myself up to fail. But if I have this criteria of other things that I do have control of that I'm measuring and improving on, just my sense of well-being is so much better.
Although you and your friend are not going easy on yourselves, choosing 13 things to improve on. 4 or 5 could be easy. Is it easy to want to maximize 13 areas though? Or is it inevitable that the more you maximize 4, 3, 4, 5 others might falter? Like, are they 13 that can truly grow together?
I'd say, I'm going to get it up actually. It's probably more of a bit like a scorecard. It's kind of in the same way if you did I know I've got these scales, you've got these scales, these smart scales at home where you stand on it for sort of 5 seconds, it pulls up all these different stats like your body mass index, your muscle percentage, like all this stuff like that. It's like, cool. There's just some that's really useful, trailing or leading indicators, but then there's a couple of core things to really lean into. So I say it's like that. There's sort of a lot in it, but there's only a handful of things that I guess you spend your time talking about. Yeah. But it more just builds a picture of, I guess, how are you doing?
Sorry, for those listening and not watching, Rory's currently pulling up his scorecards to share with us.
So in terms of different buckets, and this is inspired by, there's a founder group community in the US called Go Abundance, and the friend I catch up with is part of that. So it's a little bit inspired by that. So I can't claim any of this, but it's things like diet, exercise, just your love for work, family, friends, hobbies, adventures, risk and excitement, chill and recharge time, giving back, future planning, gratitude. There's things like that just kind of build a little bit of a picture. Like, yeah, there's a bit there to fill in, but it only takes some 10 minutes to do. And just gives you a broader view of just sort of, how am I doing? How am I living?
I mean, it's all very much, and it makes sense. Anyone who says they've got the answers for anything usually isn't somebody to trust. Everyone is very much a work in progress, trying to figure different things out, or too many things at once. What would you, with where you're at now, if somebody was going through similar things, what do you think you'd say to them? Like, what's been really effective for you?
In terms of what? In terms of managing expectations, managing.
Bit of everything, really. Don't feel you have to just do one point. Feel free to jump on different points, because I'd assume, does anyone ever come to you for like mentorship or reach out asking questions, startups? And because everyone will come with the business questions, right? They're not going to be like, how's your headspace? Like, what do you, I'm feeling this way. People will be like, have you grown this? Have you built this? How you do that? Do you ever squeeze in being like, listen, that's great, but you need to be careful of this? Like, think what could happen here.
I think it's always important to just start out with clear intentions. Like, what does success look like to you personally, and not being blindsided in time as all these other shiny objects come up, or you suddenly realize that you built a job for yourself and you're going up something that is not really in alignment with how you want to be spending your time. So things like that. And then also, in a more specific scenario with like a new business, is just being really mindful about raising any money because of the commitment you're making to said investors, and the sort of like, right, you've just locked yourself into at least a 6-year thing, or whatever that is. So it's things like that. And then, being very intentional around, I guess, some of the people that I spend time with on a recurring basis. There's a community I'm part of called SaaStock, and they have a SaaStock founder membership. And I meet up once a month with 4 or 5 other founders who are like a relatively similar kind of ballpark revenue stage. And we just chat around. Everyone has sort of 20 minutes each, talk through some plans, progress, bring a problem to get feedback on. You just learn a lot. And I think just surrounding yourself with people who are, in the trenches doing similar stuff, I think is really, really useful, both for just tactical stuff, but also just chatting shop and having someone who knows what you're going through.
So intentionality is obviously like a key factor for
Absolutely.
you now.
Yeah.
So like everything, is it reached a point where have you still given yourself some flexibility for things? It's like, it's not an all or nothing mindset, is it? It's not like, if I've not made an intention to do this, I won't do it. It's not gone too far the other way, has it?
No, I wouldn't say so. And I think with any of these intentions, there's often this sort of, what's the baseline? What's the sort of realistic and mildly optimistic outcome? Great. Let's make sure that's the minimum. And then what aspirationally does like amazing success, or what does amazing outcome look like? And it's sort of that the straddling those two, I think, is useful.
Yeah. Well, you touched on something there, which we'll go into briefly, because I don't want to dive too much into it. But one of like your biggest things, and you mentioned it at the very start, was the business where you got venture, and obviously now where you've decided to bootstrap. What was your reasons behind that? What's been the benefits of it? And from your own personal experience of both now, would you definitely always choose one over the other?
So I think for context, first time round, I think my co-founder Charlie and I both kind of had it in our mind of, you start business, you raise money. That's what success looks like. So you just kind of like bulldoze into it without really over kind of thinking it. But it's also the kind of thing when you're doing it first time round, you might often get feedback of like, you probably don't need funding. Like, take your time, just push it back. Don't do it now, or solve so you don't have to. But when you haven't done it before, you're a bit like, let me do it, and I'll see out. Like, I don't whatever. You can think that that's not going to be the case for you. Like, you're going to be different, kind of thing. And I think we definitely had the advice along the way of like, you probably don't need to raise, or is there a world where you don't raise? And we were like, no, we know what we're talking about. And I think this time round it was, I guess, obviously very biased in that last experience, but it was very intentional for a number of reasons. One, I didn't want to have that commitment to any shareholders, investors on day one. And I think I always had that mentality of, it's not off the table, but just like, not now. Let's go and validate. Let's go and prove there's something here, and that were we to raise, I know exactly where we're going to put that money. And that's kind of been the prevailing thought of like, yeah, it could be helpful now, but that's probably going to make us sprint at the wrong things. And we slowly in time build up conviction of what we're doing, that, there's definitely a future, or certain scenarios. It's like, well, maybe there is utility in fundraising now, but that's based on the uniqueness of our business, where because we charged 12-month contracts with like reasonable setup fees, you get that cash flow. So you can enable to do that. But some businesses need capital up front, but I just think that's thinking that has to be challenged. Like, but do you really need to do it? Do all three of you co-founders ever need to go full time on day one? No. How can you go and get a pilot first and then get them to prepay up front, validate it? Maybe you put in some of your own money, or you just wait till you get a certain point before sprinting at raising. And I think generally the benefits, the net benefits, I think are far superior for bootstrapping where you can, because it forces you to find product market fit, or whatever semblance you find. It forces you to get customers paying you for money.
Yeah, the only reason I said briefly I didn't want to undermine it, because it obviously is super interesting that you've had that experience, but it was mainly because that client I mentioned earlier had covered it with you, and I want to cover different ground. So that's the only reason for anyone listening. But with all this intention, what is the flexible intent for you in the business over the next few years, or even the next few months?
Flexible intent in terms of
what's the intentions for the business for the next wee while? But obviously you said you're trying to have that more flexible mindset where it's, I want this, but I'm okay if it doesn't get there. So I thought the term flexible intention might give it that malleability.
I think in the short term, it's really just continuing a lot of the stuff we're doing now, which is getting more conviction on our product roadmap, where we want to sit in the market, what's the whole sort of now, next, then side of things. And we've made some really good thinking on that already. And then it's adding more fidelity to that, and then kind of attaching, what does that mean for our go-to-market underneath? And in both of those things, getting, I guess, more conviction of like, well, what is this going to look like next, right? How do we now allocate resources accordingly to move those forward? So that I guess we're in this phase of creating further clarity of like, what is this core bit that we've already got a ton of validation that's going to drive us into this next phase of growth? Cool, right? Now, how do we resource that up appropriately?
And what about for you personally, Rory? So, because it's just, I do think it's fascinating. You're clearly on this path, like this kind of journey of growth, reflection. So where do you think that's going to take you?
Writing it out. And I mean, I say till when? Like, well, what is the finish line? But there might not be a finish line, and that's okay. Well, that and by finish line, it's like, well, what is the finish line? Is it selling it? Is it getting it sort of long term sustainable? Is it a profit share? Like, there's so many different ways of thinking about what it means to build a long term business. But I think for me, it's hard to say, because it's sort of, I'm trying to move away from too much of a finish line mentality, and it's more building a really sustainable long-term business that can thrive in the long term. And to be able to do that, for me to want to do that in the long term, means that the business is set up in a certain way that I want to keep doing that, and therefore that is success as well. It's like engineering certain things so that I'm working on what I want to be working on. We've got the right people in the right seats at the right time, doing all these other things. And it's kind of like, well, that's just building the machine to this next level that will enable me to play, I guess, a more sustainable long-term role.
I think I'm also going to remove maybe you from the situation a little bit, because it's so, everyone finds it a lot easier to be like a coach or advise people other than themselves. So if someone came to you and they had this finish line mentality, being like, oh, I want to get there, I want to do this by the end of the year, oh, I want to get here in 2 years, oh, I think I can do this in 6 months, what would you say to them?
I'd say you should definitely solve towards that. Like, work out what's it going to take, what needs to be true, and create an action plan to do it. But underneath that, or rather to the core, I'd say that's your kind of more aspirational outcome. But what's this baseline, realistic, optimistic outcome that if that doesn't come to pass, how can your time have still been worthwhile? And how can, wherever you find yourself in 2 years, still be success? And it's that kind of mindset of like, cool, yeah, we've all got these big dreams, but how can you ensure that it's still at least a baseline success, whatever happens? Like, with given all these things you don't control, how can you still ensure that it can still be a win?
Nice. And Rory, last question. 21-year-old Rory somehow teleports to the future, and you want to give him like some words of wisdom. What do you think you'd tell him?
Just realize that you've got to go through certain phases to get to the next. And just be patient. Be patient, be consistent. Don't get carried away, just focus on what's in front of you.
Well, Rory, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Johnny.